If you grew up in the 1970s, your brain was wired differently than any generation before or since. Between 1970 and 1979, childhood looked radically different. No helmets, no supervision, no internet. And psychologists now understand that this decade created a specific psychological profile that still shows up in how these people think, relate, and navigate the world today. This isn't nostalgia. This is neuroscience, developmental psychology, and generational trauma meeting at a fascinating crossroads. Let's dive into the hidden psychology of the 1970s child. Picture this. It's 1975. A 7-year-old leaves the house at 9 a.m., doesn't return until the streetlights come on, and nobody calls the police. This wasn't neglect. It was normal. Developmental psychologist Peter Gray calls this free play, and it's virtually extinct today. Children in the 1970s had an average of 3 to 4 hours of unsupervised outdoor time daily. By 2010, that number dropped to 30 minutes. Here's what this did to their brains. Risk assessment development. Without hovering parents, 70s kids had to evaluate danger themselves. Should I jump off this? Can I make that bicycle ramp work? This built the prefrontal cortex differently, creating adults with higher tolerance for calculated risk. Internal locus of control. Psychologist Julian Rotter's concept explains it perfectly. When you solve your own problems as a child, you believe you control outcomes. 70s kids developed this naturally. Modern children, with constant adult intervention, often develop external locus of control, believing outcomes depend on others. Boredom tolerance. With no screens, 70s children sat with boredom until creativity emerged. Neuroscience now shows boredom activates the default mode network, the brain state where innovation happens. These kids became adults who don't need constant stimulation. Attachment theory tells us children need secure bases. But 1970s parenting operated on what researchers now call benign neglect. Parents were physically present but emotionally distant by today's standards. The 1970s mother spent an average of 11 hours weekly on childcare. By 2012, that tripled to 21 hours. Fathers in the 70s, about 2.5 hours weekly. The concept of quality time didn't even exist yet. Here's the psychological impact. Emotional self-regulation. Without parents co-regulating every feeling, 70s kids had to process emotions independently. They learned to self-soothe. As adults, they're less likely to seek external validation and more capable of sitting with discomfort. Ambiguous attachment patterns. Many 70s kids developed what's called avoidant attachment, not from trauma, but from adaptation. When emotional support isn't readily available, children learn not to expect it. This created adults who are fiercely independent, but sometimes struggle with vulnerability. Resilience through adversity. The stress inoculation theory applies here. Moderate childhood stress without trauma builds psychological resilience. 70s kids experience this perfectly. Enough challenge to build strength, not enough to cause damage. Between 1970 and 1979, the divorce rate in America doubled. By 1979, nearly 50% of marriages ended in divorce. If you were born in 1970, there was a coin flip chance you'd experience parental divorce before adulthood. This created a specific psychological signature, hypervigilance in relationships. Children of 70s divorce learned to read emotional temperature obsessively. Is dad angry? Will mom cry tonight? This created adults with exceptional emotional intelligence, but also chronic anxiety in intimate relationships. Fear of abandonment. Attachment theorist John Bowlby would recognize this immediately. When a parent leaves the home, children internalize, people leave. Adult children of 70s divorce often sabotage relationships before they can be abandoned or, conversely, become people pleasers desperate to avoid conflict. Accelerated maturity. Psychologists call this parentification. Older children became caregivers for younger siblings or even emotional support for parents. This created exceptionally capable, responsible adults who often struggle to relax or play. Relationship template disruption. We learn love by watching our parents. When that template shatters, adult relationships become experimental. 70s divorce kids approached relationships with both hope and deep skepticism. But here's what's fascinating. Research by psychologist Mavis Hetherington found that 75 to 80% of children of divorce eventually adapt successfully. The 70s generation didn't just survive this. They created new relationship models based on choice, not obligation. By 1975, 97% of American homes had televisions. The average 70s child watched 4 to 5 hours of TV daily. But this wasn't Netflix. This was 3 channels, specific programming blocks, and content nobody was monitoring for psychological impact. The formation of shared reality. Unlike today's algorithm-driven, personalized content, everyone watched the same shows. The Brady Bunch, Sesame Street, Saturday morning cartoons. This created unprecedented cultural cohesion. 70s kids share reference points that bond them instantly. Parasocial relationships before the term existed. Media psychologist Donald Horton coined parasocial interaction in 1956, but the 70s perfected it. Children formed genuine emotional bonds with TV characters. These weren't replacements for real relationships. They were supplements that taught social scripts and emotional patterns. Gender role confusion and evolution. Shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and All in the Family challenged traditional roles while others reinforced them. 70s kids absorbed contradictory messages about gender, creating a generation more flexible about roles than their parents, but more confused than their children. Advertising and materialistic values. Here's the dark side. 70s kids were the first generation systematically targeted by advertisers. By age 18, they'd seen approximately 360,000 TV commercials. Research by psychologist Tim Kasser links this to higher materialistic values and lower life satisfaction in adulthood. The 1970s weren't just a decade, they were a psychological pressure cooker. Let's understand what was happening around these children. Post-Vietnam trauma. Even if your father didn't serve, the cultural trauma was omnipresent. News broadcasts showed war footage nightly. Children absorbed collective grief and distrust of authority without understanding it. Watergate and institutional betrayal. The president resigned in 1974. For children developing their understanding of authority and trust, this was foundational. 70s kids grew into adults with healthy skepticism toward institutions, government, corporations, even medicine. Economic instability, oil crisis, inflation, recession. Many 70s families experienced sudden downward mobility. Children remember abundance followed by scarcity. This created adults with complex relationships to money, sometimes hoarders, sometimes reckless spenders, rarely comfortable. The Cold War shadow. Nuclear annihilation wasn't theoretical. It was duck and cover drills. It was seeing bomb shelters. Psychologists now recognize this created low-grade chronic anxiety that many 70s kids carried into adulthood, a sense that everything could end at any moment. Cultural identity crisis. The 70s were trapped between the radicalism of the 60s and the conservatism of the 80s. Children absorbed confusion about values, identity, and direction. This created adults comfortable with ambiguity, but sometimes paralyzed by too many choices. Perhaps the most defining psychological characteristic of 70s raised adults is radical self-sufficiency. Let me explain why. The latchkey phenomenon. By 1976, over 7 million children came home to empty houses. They let themselves in, made their own snacks, did homework alone, and didn't tell adults about problems. This wasn't occasional. This was daily reality. Psychologically, this created premature independence. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson identified specific ages for developing autonomy. 70s kids fast-tracked this process. They became independent before they were emotionally ready, creating adults who are extremely capable but sometimes emotionally stunted. Asking for help as weakness. When you solve every childhood problem alone, asking for help feels like failure. Adult children of the 70s often struggle with therapy, delegation, and vulnerability. They'd rather suffer silently than appear incapable. Problem-solving orientation. Here's the gift. 70s adults are exceptional problem solvers. They don't catastrophize. They strategize. They don't call for help. They figure it out. This makes them incredibly valuable in crises, but sometimes isolated in daily life. Trust issues with authority. Whether teachers, parents, or government, 70s kids learned adults weren't consistently available or truthful. They developed self-reliance because external support was unreliable. Understanding 70s psychology is incomplete without examining how they form intimate relationships. Avoidant attachment prevalence. Attachment research by Mary Ainsworth provides the framework. Many 70s adults test as dismissive avoidant. They value independence over intimacy, maintain emotional distance, and feel suffocated by too much closeness. Loyalty, despite dysfunction. Paradoxically, 70s kids often stay in suboptimal relationships longer than younger generations. Why? Because they witnessed their parents' generation abandon marriages easily. They overcompensate by staying too long. Communication challenges. Emotional literacy wasn't taught in 70s homes. Feelings talks didn't exist. Many 70s adults struggle to name emotions, discuss needs, or express vulnerability. They show love through actions, not words. Friendship as chosen family. Because biological families were often unstable, 70s kids created fierce friendship bonds. These became their primary attachment figures. Adult friendships from this era often last lifetimes. They're not casual connections. Partnership models. Many 70s adults consciously parent and partner differently than their parents. They're either hyper-vigilant emotional parents or they've swung to recreating the benign neglect they experienced. There's rarely middle ground. So what does modern psychology tell us about adults who were children in the 1970s? Strengths. exceptional resilience and adaptability, high creativity from boredom tolerance, strong problem-solving abilities, realistic risk assessment, independence and self-sufficiency, loyalty to chosen relationships, healthy skepticism of authority. Challenges: difficulty with vulnerability and asking for help, avoidant attachment patterns, anxiety about financial security, tendency toward emotional suppression, complex relationships with institutional trust, sometimes excessive self-reliance that becomes isolation, difficulty with work-life boundaries. Psychologist Jean Twenge, who studies generational differences, notes that 70s-raised adults occupy a unique position: old enough to remember life before technology, young enough to adapt to it. This makes them psychological bridges between analog and digital worlds. They parent differently than they were parented, usually overcorrecting. They mentor differently, often struggling to understand younger workers' needs for feedback and validation. They lead differently, prizing autonomy over collaboration. The psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s isn't about nostalgia. It's about understanding how a specific cultural moment creates lasting neural pathways, relationship patterns, and worldviews. These adults were shaped by unsupervised freedom, institutional collapse, family fragmentation, and the dawn of the screen age. They developed independence as survival strategy, resilience as necessity, and self-sufficiency as identity. Understanding this generation means recognizing that their reluctance to be vulnerable isn't coldness, it's adaptation. Their fierce independence isn't rejection, it's how they learned to love. Their skepticism isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition from lived experience. If you grew up in the 1970s, this is your psychological blueprint. If you love someone who did, this is your decoder ring. The decade didn't just raise a generation, it created a specific psychological phenotype that we're still studying today.